The imagination likes nothing better than a blank canvas. And the future is a completely blank canvas in the sense that you can imagine what you like. But of course, like most blank canvases turn out to be mirrors of various sorts, in which we see reflected back, but from another angle, the issues of our own age.
Science fiction. It's a form that really plays on the imagination, and it uses current developments to speculate about what things might look like in the future, or in some cases, the alternative past.
Science fiction, television, film, and literature becomes a kind of sandbox for the imagination. It's a way of capturing the big questions of life.
In some ways stirs up our awareness or our understanding of what it means to be human.
It's alive!
And to encourage us, I think, in lots of ways, to think about the practical implications of our technology. These are questions that assault us here every day.
See possibilities, tackling problems, to think around them, people dreaming of how things could be.
That sense of encountering the unknown and the presence of the unknown, not with fear in the sense of fear for your life, but with the sense of presence and mystery, has spiritual seeds in it, which may grow in the reader's soul.
That is really powerful because it connects with that feeling of hope, that feeling that we as human beings can create something that's lasting and powerful and world-changing.
No matter where you go in the world, if you walk in any library, you will soon realize that one of the most fascinating and complex genres is science fiction. What emerged in the 19th century has now grown into countless imaginative branches and subgenres. There's also one very unique subgenre that's rarely talked about. It has the usual tropes of space exploration, time travel, and scientific advancement. But its authors have rebelled against the accepted grain of science fiction by intertwining theological and religious themes. And once in a while, even captured the imaginations of a much broader audience. But success has sometimes drawn criticism from both traditional science fiction readers, as well as, ironically, condemnation from religious authorities. But to understand the origins of this subgenre, you need to dig deep to an obscure writer whose works can't be found on library shelves. It's part of the story of this rebel genre and its authors whose imaginations brought science and spirituality together in their storytelling. Of course, we need to explain just what is science fiction.
There's been a lot of debate about what counts as science fiction. I think for a while there was this idea that science fiction had to contain that estranging novum, that new thing or new concept that caused the reader, that sort of confronted the reader and caused the reader to see all of reality in a different light.
Every time someone tries to come up with a definition of science fiction, the artists kind of reinvent the rules.
I like to make a distinction between two types of science fiction. You have what I refer to and others have referred to as hard science fiction, and then the other is kind of soft science fiction. Some people refer to it as science fiction and science fantasy. So the difference between hard science fiction and science fantasy is science fantasy often posits ideas that seem very impossible. It almost seems magical. And the example I use isn't from literature, but it's from Star Wars and Star Trek, so to speak. Star Wars, it has this idea of the Force, this surrounding, underlying magical energy field holding everything together. And it tries to get a little sciencey later on, but it's just this idea of something mystical mixed with science fiction elements like spaceships and lightsabers, whereas hard science fiction tends to be more realistic in that sense, more things that we might see in the natural world. For example, on Star Trek, on the original series, they had the communicators, which we have now in the versions of iPhones or Android phones.
science fiction has to be written well enough, I think, to make a claim on reality, to make you genuinely feel that this could happen.
So some people get a little upset with science fantasy because sometimes science fantasy will deal with matters of faith a little bit more than hard science fiction. Hard science fiction doesn't want to really delve into the miraculous a lot, whereas science fantasy, or just fantasy in general, would delve into the miraculous.
When Christians write Christian books, they tend to want to have that spiritual component. And it doesn't always fit easily into science fiction. It fits very naturally into fantasy, which is why I think we see so much more fantasy literature written from a Christian perspective.
What they have in common, of course, is their creativity. They're both creative. They're both products of human imagination. That image of God in which we're all created, where you create and make things.
The origins of science fiction literature, stories about great machines and traveling the stars, can go back to ancient times. In the early 19th century, however, a young English woman named Mary Wollstonecraft, eventually to become Mary Shelley, was with friends when they decided to have a friendly storytelling competition.
A bunch of, imaginative thinkers stuck in a manor house for a summer that was very bleak and rainy and dark. And the challenge was to tell ghost stories.
Shelley would eventually pen a very unique tale that would engage the imagination in both science and the soul.
She's part of a collective of artists and writers who were really exploring, most deeply the ways that they could transform romantic literature and poetry into something deep and foundational, something experimental.
And so this is where we get Frankenstein. Mary Shelley's contribution to the contest was Frankenstein, this masterpiece of English literature.
Who shall conceive the horrors of my secret toil, as I dabbled among the unhallowed damps of the grave, or tortured the living animal to animate the lifeless clay?
Transplanting body parts, which was just totally crazy idea for that time.
Frankenstein's creation is a scientific creation because Frankenstein, Dr. Frankenstein, is a scientist. And so she really becomes, in my reading of things, the first of the modern science fiction writers.
Really sets some groundwork that other science fiction writers are going to pick up on. It's also heavily Gothic, it comes out of the Romantic period as well. But at its heart, it is a story about a man, Dr. Victor Frankenstein, experimenting and creating life.
I collected the instruments of life around me, that I might infuse a spark of being into the lifeless thing that lay at my feet.
The scientific moment, the magic of what actually happens within our natural world.
And to infuse it with that animating spark of life through electricity, this new power, this new focus of technology.
And my candle was nearly burnt out when, by the glimmer of the half-extinguished light, I saw the dull yellow eye of the creature.
Shelley's Frankenstein is a science fiction experiment, but it's also a retelling of some of our greatest mythological stories. The subtitle, it talks about a modern Prometheus, stealing fire from the gods. It's a retelling of that myth.
When Prometheus gives fire to humanity, what he's doing is he's putting a spark of life in their souls. It becomes a metaphor. It doesn't have to literally be fire to humanity. He's given humanity the creative element, which ticks off the Greek gods.
But it's also a retelling of the Garden of Eden story.
The whole notion of the creature that pushes back at its creator. I mean, Frankenstein is the obvious example here, which is the story of the fall and the story of a god who makes a creature beneficently hoping for the best and finds that his creation has gone wrong on him.
Like Adam, I was created, apparently united by no link to any other being in existence. He had come forth from the hands of God, a perfect creature. Many times I considered Satan as the fitter emblem of my condition.
themes of creatureliness and the creature's relationship to the creator, and how if that relationship becomes disconnected, the creature becomes monstrous.
And then it becomes this existential crisis. As the creature is given life, he has to then decide for himself, what does it mean to be human?
What is it to be a thinking, rational being?
For Shelley, one of the ways she talks about is the soul. And this is one of the great questions, is who is Frankenstein's creation?
In a new sort of post-Enlightenment world where religion has been marginalized, we sort of feel ourselves in this metaphorical position of being creatorless. The pain and the anguish of that.
So I see in Mary Shelley someone who is struggling deeply with spiritual themes and is influenced by a very Christian culture in which she grew up in.
Suddenly, old, very ancient philosophical and religious tropes, if you like, or areas of understanding, were reflected back in this mirror of science fiction.
But Mary Shelley did something unique that other people that had technology in their works hadn't really thought of before. And the real question that we have of Frankenstein's creation is the question that we have that runs through all of great science fiction from then until today, which is, what does it mean to be human?
As the 19th century continued, post Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, literature would continue to embrace technology and scientific achievement. Two writers would be prominent in capturing readers' minds with both adventure and terror.
Jules Verne and H.G. Wells are writing the late Victorian period, early Edwardian period. They are the products of their society in which science education is flourishing. You're coming out of the Darwin's Origin of Species, there's new advancements, and I think really they're more focused on that. It's kind of the shift into what we might call the secular age.
Fiction which takes the machine seriously and even begins to explore through the imaginative realm the ever-changing and highly complex relationship between human beings and the machines they make. That suddenly echoed a big theological question, which of course the scientists and the science fiction writers alike thought they'd left behind, thought of the whole area of theological discourse as sort of historical baggage.
So they're not as concerned about religious matters. They are interested in the way technology is going to shape humanity.
Estranging novum, that new thing or new concept that sort of confronted the reader and caused the reader to see all of reality in a different light. So an example of this would be Jules Verne's 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, the submarine, the Nautilus. The technological element of the story that makes the entire story possible and makes a new reality possible for the characters.
Passing the boundary of any place that human beings have been before and carrying with them the hopes and fears of all humanity, and encountering for the first time as humanity strange new creatures, suddenly became a real possibility in the modern world. You could see the long forgotten desire for epic adventure.
Verne and Wells, I mean, they had these really progressive views on society, on social norms. Verne's book describes so many underwater creatures in such detail. It's a really exciting book to read because of that technology, but it also tells a story of really profound failure. Wells' stories really wrestle with that as well, the bleak outcomes of this overconfidence, and this idea that when we have this kind of anthropocentric worldview, we are setting ourselves up for failure.
H.G. Wells's immense body of work would include The Time Machine, The Island of Dr. Moreau, and War of the Worlds. But in 1910, he would write a lesser-known work, When the Sleeper Wakes. A story about a man who takes sleeping drugs and wakes up 2 centuries later to a society filled with wondrous technology, but staggering social injustice. The sleeper is seen as the only one that can save the world from the horrific dystopian future.
H.G. Wells is an atheistic writer writing at the turn of the century and really not bringing up a lot of theological or religious themes. He's not really stirring things so much with his science fiction.
While devoid of spiritual themes, When the Sleeper Wakes by H.G. Wells would eventually inspire one reader to write a rebuttal that would be the first of a subgenre.
Victor Rousseau is utterly fascinating to me. I mean, he has an immense body of work in all different genres. That literary output is staggering.
Today, few have heard of Victor Rousseau Emmanuel. He was born in 1879, grew up in London with a private education, and was raised in a Jewish home. Rousseau had endured school bullying, and after struggling academically, had a rocky relationship with his father. He also had an eclectic taste in reading that ranged from adventure novels to pseudo-science journals about seances and haunted houses. After failing through college, Rousseau would leave England behind for South Africa, where he attempted his hand at journalism and would briefly fight in the Boer War. In the end, he would wind up in New York City to eventually succeed as a short story writer for magazines by day while writing novels on the side. Although Rousseau had grown up Jewish, he began attending a Baptist church and listened to the preaching of a Reverend Dr. Robert MacDonald, who believed that faith and hypnotism would cure hysteria, insomnia, drunkenness, religious melancholia, and suicidal mania. By 1914, despite his relative success in writing short stories and having completed a few unsuccessful novels, Rousseau was determined to write a successful novel. His inspiration would come from both his Christian faith and the work of another author.
He's really writing in response to an H.G. Wells story, When the Sleeper Wakes. And I think he's particularly conscious of the absence of religion.
Rousseau would write a novel that would also follow a time traveler into a future of great technology and social injustice. But unlike Wells, Rousseau would make religion and its role in society a central theme in the story. He would call it the Messiah of the Cylinder.
In the beginning of the story, he actually has two characters kind of sound off on the distinction between religion and science.
This really heated conversation between a few of these different characters, the scientists and the gentleman who's funding them, about how religion, how specifically Christianity, fits into their plan.
It will go, that relic of degrading, savage superstition called the soul, the barbarous legacy of ages enshrined in 100 fairy stories.
Lazaroff is a hardcore materialist, right? He feels like the material realm is the only realm that exists.
Sir Spofforth turned to Lazaroff. You want a world of men and women reared like prize cattle and governed by laws as mechanistic as your universe, he said. That was the pre-Christian world. Your free love, your eugenics had been tried in Rome, in Sparta, in many ancient kingdoms. And we know what those civilizations were.
Rousseau's book really shows the discomfort the Christians have always had with the eugenics project. And this is a movement that started over here in the United States, exported to Europe, especially in Germany with the Nazi project, that we should breed a super race of people, with fewer flaws. And I think Rousseau's book is really wrestling with that.
Science will rule, man will be free, the logical state finally conceived by Wells. If only I could live to see it, but I was born a century too soon.
And sees faith, the things that do not involve the physical world, as some kind of weakness.
It is a dead faith with its foolish miracles, its preposterous and unscientific dualism, said Lazaroff.
That if we lose something of faith, if we lose something of the supernatural, we're actually losing something of being human.
You can hear the conversation between the author of that work and H.G. Wells, dialoguing about the difference between embracing transcendent reality and kind of a purely superficial materialism.
The way Rousseau creates time travel is through cryogenics. Characters are frozen in a cylinder.
Of course, if our friend is afraid I'm going to screw him up for a century, began Lazaroff. I'm not at all afraid, I returned. How do I get in? Lazaroff looked at me and burst into loud laughter. For instantly, the cap began to whir on the screw. Through the glass face, I caught a last glimpse of Esther's terrified eyes. I groped for memory through unconsciousness and ceased.
Tricked by his partner, pushed into this cylinder that freezes him for 100 years in suspended animation.
And discover that society has been reshaped in a very pragmatic, science-based world.
It was a world from which all the amenities and charities of life seemed to have been banished.
He awakens in this society that's completely transformed.
It is a criminal offense for mothers to teach their children fairy stories. It is the duty of the inspectors to question children rigorously in order to ascertain whether they are acquainted with any of this unscientific, heretical folklore.
The removal of religion by the removal of the family, which is also, you have to remember, the influence of Karl Marx on European thought and the way that Karl Marx frightened the religious institutions with his talk of removing both religion and the family from society.
It's a dismal dystopia, really.
A metal badge stamped with letters and figures was hung about my neck by a cord. I received a suit of bluish-gray color, the stranger's uniform.
Very imaginatively composed, and that alone will keep most readers reading if it has a good plot.
I like the main character, Arnold's kind of familiarizing himself with this new society.
I was astonished to discover that no history prior to 1945 was taught. No geography. Oxford and Cambridge had disappeared with the old public schools in 1945, after a revolution.
Reading it now, past the time in which he wakes up, it's a little odd, but that speculative fiction is certainly intriguing.
One of the things Rousseau does that I think is very interesting and also a little awkward, he puts H.G. Wells in the story.
It was then that the writings of the great Wells, since called the prophet, were discovered and proved the inspiration of the new order.
It's an interesting story to read now, suggesting that politicians get into politics for themselves, and that was bad, and it's just an interesting statement to read in our time.
And his expression was so full of sinister and malignant power that I knew this could be none other than Samson, the devil of this devil's world, who ruled a superstitious multitude by the terror of science become faith. The Christians called him the Antichrist.
What Rousseau is doing in Messiah of the Cylinder is really looking at the role of Christianity, explicitly Christianity, plays in a world where science has taken over.
Does set Christianity up as this counter-narrative.
Arguing that the absence of Christ in society, Christianity in society, creates a loss.
This intentionally suppressed worldview that is really the very worldview that the world needs in order to deal with the technology and the ethical questions that arise from the technologies.
Rousseau had a great deal of difficulty finding a publisher for the book. So he wrote it in 1914. It's published in 1917, in the middle of World War I. And the distance from Wells' original and the war happening, I'm not sure people were interested in speculations about dystopian futures in the middle of a horrific war.
Over time, the Messiah of the Cylinder would be edited, broken up into parts, and even have its name changed in an attempt to find success. Rousseau would continue writing short stories and novels, at times barely making a living. This would include the story of John Paul in 1923, a semi-autobiographical novel that would draw charges of libel from his family. It was also deemed anti-Semitic. It would never be published.
He was just writing an enormous number of stories. He wrote under so many different names that it's hard to keep track of everything. And he wrote in so many different genres, everything from detective stories to sci-fi to Canadian wilderness adventure stories. He's writing everything, publishing story after story, whatever he could sell, basically. Didn't always make ends meet that way.
During the 1930s, Rousseau would write under yet another pseudonym for Spicy Magazine, a raunchy pulp that put more emphasis on objectifying women and less on artful writing.
It's a remarkable, odd career from our perspective because nobody does this anymore. Nobody writes like this.
Rousseau's work writing shorts for magazines would eventually face the emergence of a new technology.
It seemed to me incredible that after 50 years of avid magazine reading, the public could have lost interest in that form of entertainment. And above all was the introduction of television. But this wasn't change. It was annihilation.
The later years of Rousseau's life would be summed up by unsold manuscripts, alcoholism, welfare checks, and regret. He died in 1960, sober but alone. The Messiah of the Cylinder, along with most of his body of work, was already long out of print, forgotten in the pulp of time.
Rousseau is really the first, certainly the first that I'm aware of, who addresses an explicitly theological dimension to science fiction.
In one sense, it's a very rebellious kind of, implied in that is reactionary subgenre. In another sense, I think that the religious instinct in science fiction has always been present, because then we have Christian science fiction writers who emerge later to sort of address their marginalization by this genre in general. This idea that religion is antithetical to rational thinking and therefore doesn't belong in science fiction.
Decades after Messiah of the Cylinder, another science fiction writer would make a clear theological statement. With not one, but 3 novels. Once again, H.G. Wells would be the instigator.
Almost everybody has read the Chronicles of Narnia. So if you can get past he didn't just write the Chronicles of Narnia, he also wrote this other stuff.
You quote C.S. Lewis in an American church, everybody's ears pick up because he was such a profound thinker and writer.
Both his rational mind and his imagination are both fully alive and fully realized in everything that he does.
We need that affirmation that it's okay to be a thinking Christian, a rational Christian, and it's okay to read all kinds of strange, fun stories.
During the early part of the 20th century, a young C.S. Lewis was absorbing an eclectic array of literature, from the classics, Greek and Norse, to all kinds of medieval and even more contemporary science fiction. This would include H.G. Wells.
Lewis was interested in science fiction all his life. If you look at his letters, he says that since the time he could first read, he was interested in fantasy and in science fiction and in adventure stories. So he's a lifelong fan of the science fiction genre.
Born in Ireland in 1898, Lewis's youth is one that included a miserable experience at a private school, along with a deep love and access to books. As a young man, and finding church not engaging and prayer rather tedious, Lewis had decided to be done with religion and identified as an atheist. Years later, this would all change after reading the 19th century fantasy author and Christian minister, George MacDonald.
When he talks about his own conversion story, he compares it to a game of chess. We may not be able to relate to his particular approach to faith, but we all know what a chess game looks like. And we all can imagine what it would be like to experience that game of chess with God, as he puts his own conversion story.
Considered the father of modern fantasy, MacDonald's fiction, rich with theological and spiritual concepts, would start Lewis on the eventual journey back to faith.
That night, my imagination was, in a certain sense, baptized. The rest of me, not unnaturally, took longer.
Surviving the First World War as a second lieutenant over in France, Lewis's love for literature would take him to Oxford University, where he would graduate and eventually teach. This is where his friendship with Professor J.R.R. Tolkien, a deeply devoted Catholic who also shared the love for literature and mythology, would eventually bring Lewis back to his Christian faith, but with a very different perspective.
Deep down, his soul had always resonated with the idea of certain kinds of myth or mythic tales. A myth is simply a story that encapsulates some deep truth about culture. And he had always appreciated the idea of the dying and rising God as it appears, particularly in Norse mythology. And here, what Tolkien helped him to see is that Christianity was a myth, a story, an embodiment of these deep truths, with the startling difference that it was also rooted in history. It was a myth that actually happened. Myth became fact.
Lewis and Tolkien were the core of a unique creative group called the Inklings. Included in the group would be Charles Williams, a writer whose supernatural thriller, The Place of the Lion, had inspired both Lewis and Tolkien.
It was the kind of place where you could go and you could say, I've got an idea for a story. How does this strike you? You know, you just, even before the writing takes place, you're throwing out ideas or discussing the possibilities of characters.
A group of people who love the great books and literature of the past, but they're also trying to figure out how to throw that forward in a modern world. They're in the midst of the modernist revolution. How does that work for them?
By the end of the 1930s, Lewis had published an academic book, poetry, and an allegorical work that reflected his rediscovered faith, but was pretty much unknown as an author. His friend and fellow Inkling J.R.R. Tolkien had recently finished writing a fantasy novel by the name of The Hobbit. Neither had written science fiction, but both were engaged and intrigued by the genre, so they agreed to a friendly challenge.
Really one of the most extraordinary beginnings of any story, and that's that Lewis and Tolkien are together, they're chatting, and they remark or observe that there aren't enough of the kinds of stories that they like to read.
We want to read romances, which is really the word for adventure stories. We want to read these adventure stories, but within what they called science-fiction. Science fiction is now our word.
So here are these two absolute amateur fans of the genre, and they're going to write the kinds of books that they like to read. Well, what does that mean exactly? They like, it says, excursionary thrillers that incorporate myth. To incorporate myth means that it's going to do more than just be like a cowboy story or a space alien story. It's going to, at a deep level, tap into those deeper truths about what it means to be human, about what it means to be alive, about what it means to live a life worth living.
To create the kind of world filled with the numinous and the series of mythopoeic, as they called it, resonances that would come back, they would need both space and time travel.
They toss a coin, and Lewis is assigned to write about space travel and Tolkien time travel.
C.S. Lewis is a product of books from early childhood right into his writing career.
He set about to write some science fiction and uses science fiction as a genre to explore theological ideas that he was developing in his own life.
And he just sort of starts to write about a character he calls the pedestrian. In other words, a kind of everyman going on a walk. Lewis was a great walker. He loved to take these long walks in the countryside.
In Out of the Silent Planet, a scientist and a sort of politician professor end up kidnapping a philologist, someone who teaches words, basically.
This Ransom, he's a philologist, and so is Tolkien. And so I wonder if in some level, Lewis isn't sort of getting back at his friend, sort of making fun of him a little bit. But the story starts to kind of come alive and take on a life of its own.
If you really think he's coming round, said Weston, you'd better give him another dose. It would be better if he didn't wake up until we were underway. Devine left the room. Ransom saw through his half-closed eyes that Weston was standing over him.
And they kidnap him and they take him to Malacandra, which is Mars.
When Ransom came to his senses, he seemed to be in bed in a dark room. He had a pretty severe headache. By this time, he was quite certain that something was seriously wrong with his eyes. No moon could possibly be the size of the thing he was seeing.
As he thinks about what he considers to be a true danger, and that danger is not an individual, the individual of the character Weston. That danger is a mindset, a scientism, a way of thinking about what is the goal or the chief end of our life together.
But was, I think, quite rightly challenged by and wanted to resist and reply to the rather crude, entirely this worldly materialist agenda.
Among other things, what Lewis is hoping that we'll consider is it okay to do things just because we think we can? Is it okay to explore the limits of science, the limits of space and time, and not think about the implications of why would we do this? Is it the right thing to do? Is it the best?
His mind, like so many minds of his generation, was richly furnished with bogies. He had read as H.G. Wells and others. His universe was peopled with horrors.
Of course, behind the influences of Lewis and the challenge that Tolkien gave to him is H.G. Wells, who is really the grand master of the science fiction tale, someone who Lewis encountered young and who was influential in his thinking.
In The War of the Worlds, that introduced a whole trope in science fiction where the assumption was that the alien was something appalling.
In Out of the Silent Planet, Lewis turns everything like that upside down. The two humans that kidnap Dr. Ransom and take him to the indigenous species, what they actually call savages of that other world. And he actually finds his own humanity recovering within creatures that are just so biologically different.
Suddenly the water heaved, and a round, shining black thing like a cannonball came into sight. Then he saw eyes and mouth, 6 or 7 feet high and too thin for its height. The creature was talking. It had language.
The word is hnau, is a word that Lewis invented that is used in science fiction to describe somebody who is human, like you and I, in the way that we relate and the way that we think and we can grow, but we may or may not have the same body.
Weston, the wicked scientist who's got the whole thing together and is really seeking to exploit Mars for its mineral resources and specifically for gold. But he has Weston standing there and literally in a pith helmet. This was exactly what the colonial despoilers of Africa wore.
And this is such a challenge to everything that, people believed in the period about, what civilization was and what a savage was and what indigenous peoples were like.
These people travel to a world that has never had a fall. There's never been any sin to enter into the world. But as soon as they get there, human beings mess it all up.
At that moment, Ransom was deafened by a loud sound, a perfectly familiar sound, which was the last thing he expected to hear. It was the crack of an English rifle.
Lewis had a very strong sense of just how much appalling damage was done by Western colonialism human beings from Europe went to the New World. There was a New World in that sense that was North America, and visited on it plagues and disease and oppression and genocide, and took, as it were, the natives as just people to be destroyed or exploited or enslaved.
Maybe these ideas within humankind, these ideas that have become popular in our culture, are monstrous, and we need to think a little bit about what history has told us as we go conquering new worlds. The outcome of that isn't always positive, and we need to think more deeply about what we're doing and why.
He wondered whether the difficulty of traveling beyond our own planet was itself, he called it a kind of divine quarantine.
Tolkien went to bat with C.S. Lewis and wrote several letters to publishers. The test readers for Out of the Silent Planet didn't like it. One of them said, C.S. Lewis is likely to write a worthwhile novel at some point. This one isn't good enough, quite.
People who are real fans of science fiction have trouble with it because Out of the Silent Planet was written late 1930s, talks about space travel at a time when space travel wasn't possible.
Lewis doesn't go a lot on the technical stuff, and he's not in love with machinery. So he doesn't imagine wonderfully made spacesuits or beautiful contraptions to compensate for the different gravity of Mars, although he does speculate about the different gravity of Mars.
Lewis is also writing in a way that incorporates both fantasy and science fiction. And some people don't like seeing those two things mixed in the same way. But once it's published, it does fairly well. And because of that, he's encouraged by the publishers and the public to write more of Ransom's adventures.
While Lewis's space travel adventure was already out on bookshelves, Tolkien was taking his time writing about time travel.
Well, J.R.R. Tolkien sat down and he began writing an Atlantis myth that was a time travel story.
Tolkien does not like machinery. And so while Lewis goes straight for the spaceship, right, Tolkien can't do that because even though he's doing time travel, he doesn't like machines. He's anti-mechanism, right? But he does explore time travel, and he does it in a most ingenious way. He does it through dream visions. And he starts to write a story called The Lost Road.
And it sort of gets dragged into his overall mythology, Middle-earth mythology.
He never finishes the work, but what he does say is that his work on The Lost Road set him up to understand the backgrounds of Lord of the Rings that made the Lord of the Rings possible. And so that one conversation between those two individuals brings us the science fiction trilogy from Lewis, but all of Lord of the Rings from Tolkien.
Lewis's life, along with the rest of Europe, would change at the onset of the Second World War. Single, with no children himself, Lewis offered his home to children that had been evacuated from London. While that may sound familiar, as it would later play into his children's fantasy series in Narnia, he still had his head in science fiction.
And so it's the beginning of World War II, just a little bit after Out of the Silent Planet has been published. C.S. Lewis has just finished writing a book called The Problem of Pain, which he read aloud to his writing club, the Inklings, which really asks the question, what do you do with a sense of a good God when the world just seems to bring us so much challenge and difficulty? Not long after that, the next summer, he's actually listening to a broadcast of Adolf Hitler speaking to the Reichstag. And Hitler is basically putting his challenge forward to the English people to stop their hostilities. That there was a moment that when he put himself inside of Hitler's perspective, he was won over. He landed at church one morning and the sermon was going on. Inside of his imagination, there popped a character, a demon. And this demon figure was going to give spiritual advice to a junior demon who's sent out into the world for the first time. And then eventually collected into what was C.S. Lewis's first bestseller called The Screwtape Letters. He's also begun to be the voice of Christianity on the BBC, putting out the lectures that will become Mere Christianity, one of the best-selling books of the 20th century. At the same time, he was teaching Paradise Lost.
In trying to kind of take this in a new direction, somewhat more focused, and also partaking of a particular kind of myth, the myth of the fall.
If Perelandra, Out of the Silent Planet was a conversation to some degree with H.G. Wells and Verne, then Perelandra is a conversation with John Milton.
He, in Perelandra, is doing an experiment in religious fiction. He's taking up Paradise Lost, which would have been one of the most well-read English books of the period, and he is retelling the Genesis story, the temptation scene of Genesis 3, but in this, science fiction universe, in this planet far, far away. And he has Dr. Ransom come back into his imagination. And Dr. Ransom is ultimately recruited to go to a new planet, this is Perelandra, or Venus, where he is going to encounter a new scene of temptation.
The author of Perelandra will be the motive power. You will simply move it to Venus. Don't ask me how.
And Lewis admits that, with Out of the Silent Planet, he wanted to create just enough of the science and technology to make the book believable. But by Perelandra, he's ditched that behind. He basically translates his character through space by an invented mode that actually has no relation to science.
And like so much of Lewis's fiction, he's dealing with the idea of supposal. Suppose there's a planet that hasn't fallen yet.
Get us thinking about what our world could have been like, the possibilities of an unfallen world.
He meets the Adam and Eve of that world, also the tempter of that world.
And he was chilled with an inarticulate night nursery horror of the thing he had to deal with. The managed corpse, the bogey, the unman.
The possibility that we can so compromise our soul, we can so give ourselves up to evil, that evil can actually come and dwell in us, such that there's not really any of ourselves left anymore. I wonder if he isn't in some sort of obscure way referring to that Dantean image. Dante comes to learn that these people had sinned so grievously that their souls actually descend to hell before they die, and their bodies then are overtaken by Satan, by a demon.
And the hero, Ransom, is not only a witness to that temptation, but is able, on the basis of our own experience of a fallen planet, to enter into the conversation.
Dr. Ransom finds that he's actually in the midst of a battle that he cannot win because he's with a deceiver and he has to tell the truth. And truth is actually complex. And it always looks better in just a few words, in an advertisement-style argument like what the demonic character is able to give.
But I think that Lewis is also dealing with a really, really hard question, and that is, what if the way to overcome evil is to do it not only intellectually and morally and spiritually, but also in terms of our physicality, in terms of a physical stand against those things that are evil and wrong and destructive. And that's what Ransom has to wrestle with as he's making his way or negotiating his way through Perelandra.
All through his books of World War II is a kind of cultural criticism. But we really get this in That Hideous Strength, which is the final book of this kind of science fiction experiment of World War II era.
Now, the title of that book is highly significant, and he even gives in the preface, in the little thing, he gives the source of it, but nobody pays any attention to it. The shadow of that hideous strength. 6 miles and more it was in length. And the poem is about the Tower of Babel. And there you get the whole mythopoeic thing. The story of the Tower of Babel in the book of Genesis is human beings getting together and saying, let us make a name for ourselves. And they're trying to build a tower up to heaven. In other words, they're trying to challenge God for the Godhead. they're making themselves equal with God.
In That Hideous Strength, we have a dystopia, a very clear dystopia.
An authoritarian government. I mean, all the fears that he would have felt during World War II.
And the gradual revelation of what had been going on in Nazi Germany, and particularly the harnessing of science or pseudoscience of its day to the machinations and operations of the state.
The dangers of scientism, not science, but scientism, putting too much faith in technology, ignoring the value of the human person in favor of advancement at any cost.
That's the kind of progress of his thought as Lewis is moving through World War II.
There are a lot of things, particularly in that third book, That Hideous Strength, that seem to come out of the blue.
Merlin had not died. His life had been hidden, sidetracked, moved out of our one-dimension time for 15 centuries. But under certain conditions, it would return to his body.
And it is difficult, really, to grapple with that and to understand what he's doing, to awaken something deep from within the earth, to hearken back to old pagan understandings of things. Those are some of the sort of themes that he's trying to bring out in including Arthurian legend.
But in this novel, That Hideous Strength, it's actually bureaucracy.
Where they have a thing called the pragmatometer, which is where all the committees and subcommittees have an electronic, except I think it's mechanical way, of sending their findings to the next committee, and then the next committee gets them. And then there's this huge board with everything changing, like a sort of flight departure board at an airport. But all it's doing is telling you the minutes of all the committees, you know. That's a piece of satire.
The irony of the National Institute of Coordinated Experiments being nice. And I think Lewis is definitely writing a satirical perspective on that kind of thing.
A collective, they have a certain kind of goal, and they begin to control things like the scientists, the colleges, the press, the environmental regulations. And when they can control those things, then ultimately they can conquer the world.
Isn't it absolutely essential to keep a fierce left and a fierce right, both on their toes and each terrified of the other? Of course we're non-political. The real power always is.
The role of grace, I think, is so important in That Hideous Strength. How do grace and kindness and the possibility of turning or repenting or changing, how are those celebrated in various parts of the story, I think, become very important to us.
But this is the message of the gospel that Jesus turns upside down. He lived in a world where power was held by the powerful, by those in authority, by those in control. And he turns that message upside down, and so he becomes weak in that place. So in that dystopian world in which Jesus walked, where his people were under the control of the Roman Empire, a world where another empire had control of his very life, his very existence, Jesus begins to show mercy and kindness. And so we see this. The gospel reverses what our world is talking about and what everyone else is saying takes to win. They say, oh, kindness and mercy will never win. Kindness and mercy will never rule. And Jesus says, let me show you a different way.
As the Second World War came to an end, That Hideous Strength would be published on the same week as the dropping of the atomic bomb on Japan. It would at the same time draw a fascinating review from another dystopian author.
That supernatural element is not always well received by fans of science fiction. That was what George Orwell objected to.
Mr. Lewis appears to believe in the existence of such spirits, and of benevolent ones as well. He's entitled to his beliefs, but they weaken his story.
Orwell says you can't have miracles. You can't have the magical show up. He kind of thought of it as like cheating, right?
However, by the standard of the novels appearing nowadays, this is a book worth reading.
1984 is actually clearly, in some small ways, a response to C.S. Lewis's That Hideous Strength. Both books are about language. Both books are about totalitarian institutional control. George Orwell has a completely secular, naturalistic worldview. For him, what we see and touch and feel, that's the real stuff. But Lewis has this world of imagination and spirituality that goes beyond what we can see and weigh and walk with.
Lewis had gone from space travel science fiction to science fiction fantasy, and finally science fiction dystopian fantasy. To this day, Lewis is recognized as an early part of the speculative and imaginative science fiction genre, but also a pioneer in the Christian science fiction subgenre. He would move on to fantasy, writing the phenomenally successful Narnia series.
C.S. Lewis is one of the most fascinating writers of his generation, simply because he's writing in so many different forms. He's writing Christian apologetics, he's writing literary criticism, he's writing fantasy literature and sci-fi literature. There's a vast body of work.
But the three books known as the Ransom trilogy wasn't quite the end of Professor Ransom's adventures. After C.S. Lewis's death in 1963, as his estate was being cleared by his brother Warnie, many of his unknown manuscripts were saved from destruction by Lewis's personal secretary, Walter Hooper.
And he rescued a lot of stuff that would have just gone on the bonfire. Warnie, Lewis's brother, was just burning stuff, And he's going, no, I think that might be good, And I mean, I feel a personal debt to Hooper because he rescued so many of Lewis's poems.
Walter Hooper has spent a lifetime doing all that he can to help us to understand Lewis and to have access to Lewis's legacy. And in that way, we owe a great debt to Walter Hooper. And in this case, this one is rescued, and Walter has brought it out in the form of The Dark Tower.
It's unfinished. It's a complicated story. Unlike space travel or kind of dealing with Earth, it's like interdimensional travel and this other world that kind of a dark mirror of ours.
The rays pass through the chronoscope onto the reflector, and our picture of the other time then appears on the sheet.
Apparently was intended to be a story that came after Out of the Silent Planet.
Ransom is a secondary character.
I don't like it, said Ransom. After a short pause, he added, but I can tell you one thing. I've seen that building.
It starts in a negative place and kind of goes down, but I think it was probably the narrative problems that were the reason that he didn't continue work on that.
The man had a sting. It was in his forehead, like a unicorn's horn. With a movement like the dart of a dragonfly, the stinging man had shot out his hands and gripped the other by the elbows.
And it's not very good. I think it's one of those cases where Lewis started to write a story and hoped that it would kind of get some traction, and he just wasn't happy with where it was going, and he abandoned it. Lewis is committed to beautiful storytelling, to telling the very best story that he can, and because he is a man of deep and profound faith, I think that his Christian themes are inevitably going to show up in the kinds of things that he creates. It's part of his fingerprint on the work. It's that he is writing the things that are closest to his heart, the things that he understands to be true about the universe and about people and about the direction that culture is headed.
The trilogy following Professor Ransom would for the most part fade from popular culture. But a few decades after, there would be another imaginative author, one that would take up the challenge of writing science fiction, infused with spiritual and theological ideas.
Madeleine L'Engle is a great example of someone who does everything wrong and yet gets it all right. There are lots of women novelists, but not a lot of experimental fiction writers who are women at the period. And then even more than that, she wants to write science fiction, which is almost completely a man's world. And the last thing that Madeleine L'Engle does wrong is she writes a religious book.
Madeleine L'Engle was born in 1918 in New York City, and she was the daughter of parents who were musicians, they were literary people. She was just part of this incredibly artistic community in New York City, but she was an only child, and she was home alone a lot. Like, her parents would leave after dinner to go to the opera because her father wrote reviews, and she'd be home alone with the housekeeper, so her best friends were books.
Young Madeleine would grow up in an Episcopalian Christian tradition, and her imagination would be exposed to all kinds of literature. This would include George MacDonald and the Bible.
She was given everything to read, including the scriptures, read those in the same way that she would read Hans Christian Andersen's fairy tales. And so there was nobody foreclosing on what the Bible meant. Like, she was able to enjoy it the way a child enjoys any story. Exciting and interesting and as captivating as any fairy tale that she would have read in any of those other books. You know, engaging this young imagination and drawing her closer to a sense of being part of a bigger story in which God was involved. But that isolation meant that over time she really had a hard time building friendships. She traveled all over the place with her family, so they moved to Switzerland. In some ways, Europe was cheaper to live in after the war for artist types. And one day her parents dropped her off without warning at a boarding school in Switzerland and left her there. She's the awkward kid who's just like physically awkward. It's not the one that you want on your team for any sports. She would make up for that by writing and inventing stories and drawing pictures. And she points to that as one of the hardest moments of her childhood, and it was a bitterly awful place to be. And her engagement with worship, you know, was chapel at this horrible boarding school, this English boarding school in Switzerland. So she was in many ways a survivor. And it was books and writing that stepped in for a child that was really kind of broken. She lost her dad when she was 17 and went to church right after that, trying to find a faith community that could embrace her and carry her and walk alongside her during that time of loss. They didn't do what needed to happen in that moment, and it was a loss for the church that they lost Madeleine L'Engle at age 17. So she became agnostic and at times an atheist.
L'Engle would attend Smith College in Massachusetts, but would eventually find her way back to New York City. As a young woman, she had made up her mind to be a writer, and to support this goal, she would work at the theater.
Anybody from New York now would be like, that's insane that you would work for the theater in order to fund your writing career. So.
After appearing in a play together, L'Engle would fall in love and marry Hugh Franklin. She would also publish her first novel, a semi-autobiographical called The Small Rain.
She and Hugh are part of the theater scene, but then the United States drops the atomic bomb. Ordinary Americans are shocked and horrified that this even exists in the world, and terrified that we are not the only nation that has this power. What would the retaliation be? It would be to bomb cities like New York. She's newly married, they want to start a family. If you could leave the city, you would do it.
The young couple would move to an old farmhouse in Connecticut and purchase a local general store while starting a family. Hugh would run the store while L'Engle would take care of the kids while pursuing her writing career. She would also find herself not only attending local church, but conducting the choir.
And this was a really tough decade. She was getting a lot of rejections after having published 4 or 5 novels. The first to great acclaim, The Small Rain, and she was really struggling spiritually, right? This is where she's starting to reach out to the Congregationalist minister and being like, I have a lot of spiritual questions. And she's struggling artistically with like, what is gonna be the outflow of this? How am I even gonna get my work done with small kids? Congregationalist minister would give her theologians to read. When C.S. Lewis says that he was the product of, long corridors and bookshelves full of books, Madeleine was also. She's reading Einstein, so maybe, She hated it. She hated these, even the philosophers. At that time, she's reading astrophysicists and quantum theory. Trying to be a writer, but also parenting small kids out in the middle of nowhere where she didn't have any support. On her 40th birthday, she gets yet another rejection from another publishing house and throws the cover over her typewriter and vows, that's it. It must not be meant to be. But then as soon as she does that, she realizes that she's creating a novel about rejection. She's like almost instantly wanting to tell a story about rejection. And she's realizing I can't not write. I can't not invent things. Whether or not I'm published is irrelevant to the fact that I'm called to do this.
L'Engle and her husband Hugh would decide to move back to New York City, where he would pursue acting again and she could reconnect with the literary world. But before this, they would plan a cross-country trip.
And so they take their elementary-age children on this 10-week camping trip, and the box of books that she brought with her included Albert Einstein and Arthur Eddington, and she's reading books that none of us would bring on a camping trip. They're having to set up camp and cook food from scratch, and they're using bonfires under the stars. And at a certain point, they're driving along the road, she turns to her children and she says, I just thought of characters in a book called Mrs. Who, Mrs. Which, and Mrs. What's-It. What do you think of that?
It was a dark and stormy night. In her attic bedroom, Margaret Murray, wrapped in an old patchwork quilt, sat at the foot of her bed and watched the trees tossing in the frenzied lashing of the wind.
I do think that the Wrinkle in Time for her was a way to mark the moment when she recognized that the same God who created these far-flung galaxies and who created every tiny, invisible electron is the same God who cares for each one of us.
She has as the protagonist a girl who's great at math but just doesn't fit in well in her school, and her hair is out of place, and she kind of gets antsy and impatient sometimes.
School was all wrong. She'd been dropped down to the lowest section in her grade. That morning, one of her teachers had said crossly, "Really, Meg, I don't understand how a child with parents as brilliant as yours are supposed to be can be such a poor student."
Meg is not the popular girl. She's not the successful girl. Things come difficult for Meg.
If you don't manage to do a little better, you'll have to stay back next year.
Which almost no other science fiction writer up to that point had ever done. Girls were not interested in science or math. They weren't good at it or whatever.
Often the people who like this book are young women because they saw for the first time maybe a character that looked like them.
That was very salutary for a boy to read, actually. It was great. I know there are lots of girls who identified with Meg and who were feeling socially awkward or left out, or who's had an absent father, or any of those other things that Meg has.
It's not her awesomeness that is critical, Meg, the main character. It's actually her flaws that become her kind of superhero strength.
And as Madeleine is developing this character and developing that story, we see her pressing in to what she said theologians will often call, and what I remember learning about when I studied theology, was the scandal of particularity, right? That God would choose a particular person from a particular people in a particular nation, in a particular part of the world, at a particular century to essentially save us all. Like what this one particular event did affected the entire universe. Which is, of course, a scientific idea, right? Like, no neutron moving out in space is not somehow affecting what's happening here. It's all connected. If God could care about all of those little tiny things, then certainly God would care about Meg Murray.
This is one of those ways, that C.S. Lewis talks about getting past the watchful dragons, and being able to hit upon through an imaginative and a playful narrative that is at the same time very profound.
It was true that Charles Wallace seldom spoke when anybody was around, so that many people thought he'd never learned to talk. "Don't worry about Charles Wallace, Meg," her father had once told her. Meg remembered it very clearly because it was shortly before he went away. "There's nothing the matter with his mind. He just does things in his own way and in his own time."
A plucky little kid who was called a moron and a girl with glasses, that was stirring stuff.
For me, the best stuff is actually that the hero is a little girl, and she's the conquering knight going to save the kidnapped princess, who's her dad. It's a great upside-downness. Yeah.
Mrs. Which's authoritative voice called out, "Quiet, child!" Did a shadow fall across the moon? Or did the moon simply go out?
I think it appealed to children of all types. Boys and girls could read it. But ultimately, it's a story of family.
She's got to cross, galaxies and space and time in order to save her father.
Darkness has a tangible quality. The tingling in her arms and legs grew stronger, and suddenly she felt movement. This movement, she felt, must be the turning of the Earth, the rotating on its axis, traveling its elliptic course about the sun.
A Wrinkle in Time is a great space age fairy tale. Now, it's space age in that we go off to space. It's never committed only to fantasy. These are other worlds, and there are technological aspects. A Wrinkle in Time is filled with mathematics and physics, and it's very technical in those kinds of ways.
Mrs. Watson sighed. Explanations are not easy when they're about things for which your civilization still has no words.
She did a thing that any great science fiction book do, which is to deliver to you a new concept which is viable in this world and helps you think in a new way. And the idea of a fourth dimension and the whole idea of the tesseract, where you've got the thread and the two bits brought together and the stepping across, which is the tesseract.
Traveling at the speed of light. That, of course, is the impractical long way around. We've learned to take shortcuts wherever possible. Sort of like in math, Meg asked. Like in math.
And the experiment in sort of time-space travel that happens in A Wrinkle in Time is actually sort of one of those possible theories that still happens when people think about what is possible in the physical world and how can we play with it in literature.
I love the way she talks about these things in such a normal way. As a Christian, science is such a natural part of her language.
In other words, to put it into Euclid or old-fashioned plain geometry, a straight line is not the shortest distance between 2 points.
It's such a smart book. It's filled with dozens and dozens of quotations, from Plato and Aristotle, and quotations in German and Latin and Greek and philosophers and poets. It's just filled with quotations. It's full of religious quotations.
As someone who did not grow up in a church-going home or religious home, I did not catch all of the scripture references and all of the movements that she was bringing to that writing. She wove them in such a way that my 9-year-old self, who would have just ignored it out of hand, just read and enjoyed.
If you were to talk about Lewis having his imagination baptized by George MacDonald as a teenager, I wouldn't be surprised to hear Madeleine talk about George MacDonald in that language of baptizing her imagination. She never said it that way, but she would point to him in many ways as both a spiritual and a literary father for her. He fearlessly engaged the imagination, even in ways that, his own churches didn't agree with. And I think that was probably compelling for her.
If it's too explicit and too dogmatic and too evangelistic, it tends to not be good art. Wrinkle in Time perfectly balances those two things. The Space Trilogy does the same thing.
So one of the things to understand about Madeleine, and I'm going to quote Don Hedinga here, he's a professor at Calvin College, is that she refused to limit God in any way. Where other Christians would say that religion and science can't be in conversation, she was like, why? God owns all of it. Like, what is the problem? And the same with art and faith.
And she was rejected dozens and dozens and dozens of times from publishers. And yet, it becomes really one of the more important books of the 20th century.
Came out in 1962, won the Newbery in 1963, and Madeleine's career went up from there.
A book that girls and boys can read and actually see themselves in the great adventure that Meg and her siblings and friends are taken on. And I think it's a genius book for all that.
You know, you would think then that she would continue with like the series, you know, that she would just keep writing books within that series, which is what any self-respecting author would do if they wanted to make their publisher happy. The sequel to it, A Wind in the Door, doesn't come out for another 10 years. And in between, she was busy writing poetry and publishing Christian nonfiction and doing whatever she wanted.
While it would take some time, the adventures of Meg Murray and her brother would eventually continue into 4 more books. The second, A Wind in the Door, would focus on Charles Wallace.
She does something really unusual that you only ever see, you know, authors like C.S. Lewis and even J.R.R. Tolkien, and to some extent George MacDonald, but he just couldn't quite go there. And that is naming the darkness and evil for what it is. The evil powers at work in her stories as the demonic. And maybe that's where some of the confusion came in with some of her Christian detractors. But like in The Wind in the Door, there's this moment where Meg encounters the demonic, and it's terrifying. For about a paragraph, it's almost like you're reading a horror novel.
In a way that she had never known a man could scream, a high, piercing screech. Then he rose up into the night like a great flapping bird, flew screaming across the sky, became a rent, an emptiness, a slash of nothingness. Meg found that she, too, was screaming.
And then the moment passes and she's rescued from it. At the same time, she has these unbelievably compelling angelic beings in her stories who are even more powerful than the powers of darkness. But when you think about it, you know, this person has been raised as an Episcopalian. The baptismal language within the Episcopal Anglican tradition is like, we repudiate the devil, you know? Like we renounce it. This is strong language. So Madeleine's not playing around. You know, that language of renouncing evil for her was real, and she felt you could empower children to do that.
The ideas that L'Engle wrote into her children's fiction and the imagery she presented would eventually draw the focus of religious detractors who felt it was New Age, and some even getting the Meg Murray stories banned from schools and libraries.
The church, as we all know, has a history of not welcoming ideas that seem to challenge the status quo. And that's what happens with L'Engle.
Really, I think the first time through when I read it, I was really surprised by how overt, you know, some of her theological claims are about the fact that Christ's redemption of the world does apply, you know, galactically, if you will.
It would be L'Engle's ideas of God's love applying to the entire universe, along with reference to various historical figures, that would be considered the most controversial.
And we're not alone, you know, children, came Mrs. Watson, the comforter. All through the universe it's been fought, all through the cosmos. And my, but it's a grand and exciting battle. Who've our fighters been? Calvin asked.
One of these fighters, as she calls them, fighters for the good.
Mrs. Who's spectacles shone out at them triumphantly. And the light shineth in darkness, and the darkness comprehended it not. Jesus, Charles Wallace said. Of course, Mrs. Watson said. Go on, Charles, love. There were others. Leonardo da Vinci, and Michelangelo, and Bach, and Pasteur, and Madame Curie, and Einstein, and Schweitzer, and Gandhi, and Buddha, and Beethoven, and St. Francis.
Other, important figures in society who have fought for the good, who have shown people, the peaceful path.
While initially horrified and deeply hurt by the accusations, which would go on for decades, L'Engle would eventually learn to dismiss it as nothing more than good publicity.
When we do ban books because we get upset with them, it doesn't take very long for those books to become something that are recommended to us.
She was bound to be controversial because on one hand, she angers people who don't want to hear that this is a universal redemption, the redemption of Christ is universal. And on the other hand, she angers the people who don't want to see Jesus put on the same footing as the Buddha. So in that sense, she was bound to create controversy because she's really saying something very new and radical in the sense that it could be both. It could be both of these realities.
So it just strikes me like how isolated she probably felt a lot of the time, and how important it was for her to engage faith communities that felt that what she was doing was what the Holy Spirit was calling her to do, and it was in fact changing lives.
17 years later, I read it because it was a recommended book on my school reading list in Mississippi, in a very conservative part of the country, in a very religious part of the country. So that's how we can shift as a culture so quickly.
She would really push back against this idea that whatever we might discover in science could somehow disprove things in the Christian faith. For her, it was all Psalm 19. The heavens are declaring the glory of God. Anything that any astrophysicist would discover would only deepen our understanding of who God is and how God works in the world.
A Wrinkle in Time would be L'Engle's most popular and widely celebrated novel. Even to this day, it can still be found on library shelves and lists of recommended reads. Not to mention a blockbuster adaptation of the book starring Oprah Winfrey and Reese Witherspoon.
But she didn't disappear, and by the time she died in 2007, she had published upwards of 60 titles in a variety of genres.
L'Engle is, in many ways, the literary heir of C.S. Lewis. She's probably the most interesting creative writer that comes out of the next generation.
What amazes me about Madeleine L'Engle, and C.S. Lewis for that matter, it wasn't the genre they were interested in so much as it was the ideas that they wanted to express, and it just happened to be science fiction that fit that.
Nobody writes a novel in a vacuum. It's always engaged with the things that have come before. What that looks like changes as time goes on. I think if somebody were to write in dialogue with, if we could say it that way, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein in today's day and age, some of the questions that are being asked about what it means to be human, questions that Mary Shelley was wrestling with the creature, what does that look like when it's artificial intelligence? If it's an android, what does it mean to be human? How do we define that?
It's a deeper, longer conversation, because great art always turns in the end to the same great themes. How are we best to exercise our freedom? The relationship between freedom and constraint, between love and power. What's the nature of human responsibility? Why is there such a thing as evil, and how does it work out? How can it be resisted? How do people become corrupted? Can they be redeemed? These are the big questions that anybody, whatever their worldview or faith frame, are going to consider.
You know, this subgenre of Christianity, on one hand, rebels against this idea that religion and science are just in this eternal war with each other. They enter in and ask the theological questions and give Christianity as a kind of counter-narrative to this kind of what they see as an overly hubristic narrative of machine science or rationality only.
100 years after it was written, the Messiah of the Cylinder would reawaken, as surviving copies have now been digitized and made available online. You can even have it printed and delivered to your home. Rousseau is now recognized by literary historians as a unique pioneer of Christian science fiction. Of course, the big question is, what happened to the genre after L'Engle?
Why didn't it stick, or why didn't others follow along? And I think this happens because of two main reasons. One, I think, to be fair, there's not always a lot of depth. The Christian writing market doesn't always fill itself with the imaginative world that people like C.S. Lewis and Madeleine L'Engle, and the books that they read, nobody's reading. The images that they played with, nobody's playing with anymore. The experiments and the risks that they're willing to take. And the second reason is that we no longer have a shared audience. We can see the split with C.S. Lewis and George Orwell. George Orwell is able to write to a world that, there may be a God, but it doesn't matter for his fiction. That's really what defines writing for the next 75 years or so. Fantasy can sometimes capture it, Harry Potter can do it, but for the most part, they've moved on. And we're really looking at worlds you can't expect the supernatural.
That's not to say that there's not really interesting, deep theological conversations about science fiction that can be happening between, Frank Herbert's Dune and the works of Arthur C. Clarke and Isaac Asimov and Ursula K. Le Guin. Really interesting conversations about theological matters.
The scientific discoveries, the scientific progress that we're making, are we making good ethical choices? So I think that Lewis is worth reading and rereading because of the way that he awakens our moral imagination.
So whatever science fiction inspires you to make something new, that is a part of God's divine love working in and through you to make something. Yet it can also warn us that when we create something new without any spirituality, without any morality behind it, we could create something that could be horrific and have horrible side effects on the world.
I know what it feels like to be God.
And so science fiction allows us as Christians to address both of those things very deeply and very powerfully.
Particularly when we're thinking about the great unknown, which is the topic of the future of science fiction. The imagination bodying forth can really tell us things. And there are so many images from these great works, which, although they're fictional images in the sense that they didn't happen or haven't happened yet, they nevertheless embody real truths for us.
And so he had no fear of fiction and legend and myth, and neither did Madeleine. But likewise, neither of them would, despite all of Madeleine's incredible reverence for science, they didn't feel compelled to allow that to have the last word either.